unveiling the truth about Megan Parra murder. She was a beautiful and devoted mother of 2 boys, a daddy's girl sometimes. She had everything she ever wanted, a caring husband and a loving family. What more could Megan Parra want? Yet her life was far from picture perfect. One summer morning, her parents walked into her house only to find her lying helplessly on the floor. The police hastily labeled her death as suicide. Megan was a happy soul. Why would she take her life? Megan Parra's story is a tale of betrayal, unexpected twists, and a web of lies. Join us as we unravel this mystery. Who is Megan Claire Ducote? Megan Parra was the last child of Missy and Steve Ducote. She was born on November 7, 1984, in Alexandria, Louisiana. In addition to being a daddy's girl, she enjoyed love from her mum and sisters. The love was infectious. She shared some of it with her friends and kindergarten children, whom she taught. Megan was a vibrant woman with a natural fragrance that drew people to her. Growing up in a loving family was a plus. She spent most of her childhood with her family, making memories. She was content with her life and prayed to God that it remained that way. While in her early 20s, she met a young nurse brimming with life. Dustin Michael Parra bonded with her so fast. It didn't take long before they believed they were soulmates. The couple soon made their union official. They agreed to start a beautiful family together. Dustin proposed to Megan, and they walked down the aisle weeks later. Megan was excited to do life with him. He was a hard-working young man who invested his all in the relationship. He professed his love daily, and she didn't imagine that anything could go wrong. The couple started their family right there in Cottonport, not too far from Megan's family house. Megan would sneak in to see her parents and sisters occasionally. Months later, they welcomed a boy and then another boy. Megan's mother, Missy, helped with the kids whenever she was away. Megan loved her boys and would call frequently to ensure they were fine. Her marriage seemed perfect on the outside. Unknown to her parents, their last child was battling something she didn't share with anyone. The challenges tested the strength of her marriage. When her mother sensed things weren't going well, Megan reassured her that everything was fine. Missy Ducote had one regret. She was not persistent. If she were, she probably wouldn't have walked into her daughter's lifeless body. Megan Parra's death. On June 27, 2014, Megan's parents and husband rushed to a crash site. Their daughter and wife was driving alone down a stretch of road not too far from her house. Suddenly, she veered off the road and hit the tree. Officers said she was driving about 45 miles an hour and was not distracted. She wore her seatbelt too. Megan suffered minor injuries. However, the police were worried about the manner of the crash. They argued that she did not apply the brakes. In fact, an officer asked her father questions regarding her mental health. He inquired if there was anything that could drive her to harm herself, but Steve responded in the negative. Steve was confident that his daughter was fine. Missy Ducote reiterated his stance too. "Maybe she lost focus," she said. Megan later told her husband the brakes didn't work, so she hit the tree to avoid the river. Since she was safe, the family didn't make a fuss about the accident. Dustin took her to the Avoyelles Parish Hospital, where he worked to treat her wounds. She returned home with Dustin, leaving her boys in the care of her parents. The following morning, she texted her mum to find out how her boys were doing. It was a straightforward message. Missy informed her she was fixing breakfast for the kids and would bring some to her later that morning. Her mum ended the call asking how she was doing. Megan was positive. About an hour later, Dustin phoned in to say that Megan was going to take a bath while he went to fill a prescription for her at the local Walmart. He promised to pick up the kids on his way back from the store. Steve and Missy waited for their son-in-law for over an hour, but he didn't show up. Missy was impatient. She persuaded her husband to visit their daughter. Steve obliged. The couple arrived at their daughter's house at about 10 a.m. on June 28, 2014. They found the unthinkable. Megan was lying on the floor with a blood pool around her head. Steve turned to his right, only to find the murder weapon tucked against her leg. He called 911 while Missy, a trained nurse, tried to resuscitate Megan. Luckily, Megan still had a pulse and was breathing. Her parents were hopeful. Steve Ducote also called Dustin to report the incident. Dustin said he was in Mansoura, a few miles from the house. The police arrived minutes later with Dave Blanchard in charge of the crime scene. He was greeted with Megan Parra's body lying on the floor. Meanwhile, as Dustin entered the living room, he slid on the floor just right beside his wife. The coincidence was surreal. At that very moment, he retrieved a picture from Megan's pocket. It was a photo of their boys. Dustin then knelt beside his injured wife to try to save her. Minutes later, paramedics arrived and swiftly evacuated her. She was taken to the trauma center in Lafayette. Meanwhile, Dave Blanchard stayed behind to take pictures of the crime scene. He collected evidence from the gun, the house, Dustin's blood-stained shorts, and a suicide note found on the kitchen counter. The paper had a short text saying, "Tell the boys I love them. I'm sorry." Steve and Missy were in tears that morning. They were unable to fathom the idea that their daughter could have taken her life. Megan was such a happy woman. She wouldn't do that. Doctors told the family that they had done all they could to revive her. Unfortunately, she was not responding to treatment. That's when her family made the hardest decision ever. They took her off life support and donated her organs. Her body was then transferred to a medical examiner's office for an autopsy while her family went to meet Detective Christopher Knight. Knight worked with the Cottonport Police Department. He was in charge of the investigation. The first meeting was brief. Knight spoke to Dustin, Steve, and Missy. Unlike many murder cases the Ducotes witnessed, Knight didn't ask too many questions. Steve and Missy questioned the investigation into their daughter's death. They doubted it would amount to anything. The next day, Christopher Knight showed up at the Ducotes' home with some news. He told the family that Megan's fingerprints were all over the gun. Dustin's prints were on it too, but it was no big deal. It's his gun. Steve would later learn that Knight lied. The gun at the crime scene was never tested. It gave Megan's family another reason to doubt the investigation. The autopsy result. Megan's autopsy result was out 3 weeks after her death. The medical examiner declared the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head and the manner of death as suicide. Megan tested negative for sedatives. The result confirmed Knight's theory that Megan's fingerprints were found all over the gun. Megan's family was heartbroken when Christopher Knight closed the investigation and summarized it in a one-page report. He summarized his findings in this statement. According to the evidence, collected statements from family and doctor's report, this investigation shows Megan Parra did, in fact, commit suicide. And that was it. They dwelt on the medical examiner's results without further probing. Megan's sister, Betsy Jean Son, was heartbroken. She was pregnant with her first child at the time, and Megan was so happy for her. She was planning her baby shower and even called to ask the color of balloons she wanted. Megan looked forward to the baby shower and her soon-to-be nephew or niece. On top of that, she was a few months away from getting a master's degree. This extra degree qualifies her to be a school principal. She looked forward to the promotion. The more her family thought about the alleged suicide, the less it made sense. Megan would naturally hold on to hardship for the sake of her boys. What changed? As Steve questioned her death, he examined the crime scene. There was no proof of forced entry. The crime happened behind closed doors. No other person was with Megan except his son-in-law. He guessed that Dustin may have shot her and tried to cover it up. He had many questions, but the police were unavailable to answer them. Investigators overlooked the fact that Dustin provided conflicting reports about his whereabouts. They didn't follow up on his extramarital affairs or inquire about the state of his marriage. The police had concluded the investigation and shifted their focus to another case. October 13, 2021, was a significant moment for Megan's family. It was the day their prayers were answered. On this day, the grand jury formally charged Dustin with second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Dustin was arrested for the first time since his wife's death. He pleaded not guilty through his attorney, George Higgins. Megan's family prepared for their day in court nearly 9 years after she died. The prosecution put up a strong case. They argued that the victim was shot around 7:30 a.m. that day, but her husband abandoned her to go to Walmart. As for the supposed suicide note, Steve hired a handwriting expert to testify that it was most likely not written by Megan, and even if it was not a suicide note. Maybe it was her last words to Dustin before leaving the marriage. Meanwhile, the defense argued that the blood spatter on Dustin's shorts was not proof that he was present when the gun went off. Moreover, Megan tried to commit suicide by ramming into a tree. Megan Parra's murder trial was set for March 27, 2023. But then, a shocking twist. Dustin Parra's attorney phoned prosecutors 3 days before that day, asking for a plea. He said his client was willing to plead no contest to negligent homicide. Negligent homicide is not considered a violent crime in Louisiana. It only carries a sentence of up to 5 years. Steve initially objected. He didn't want his daughter's killer to walk a free man. Above all, he wanted to clear Megan's name. He finally accepted the deal on the condition that Dustin answered some questions. The suspect agreed to the following. He admitted that his marriage was struggling before Megan's death. He admitted that on the morning of the shooting, they were arguing, and Megan threatened to leave. He acknowledged that he had a pistol in his hand, and during the scuffle, the gun went off, and a bullet hit her. He admitted leaving the house and returning only after her father called him. After admitting these facts, Judge Kerry Spruill sentenced him to 5 years in prison. If released early, he will serve the remaining time on parole. He is currently held at the Dixon Correctional Institute. While this judgment relieves Megan's father, several friends and family were unsatisfied with the ruling. After successfully proving that their daughter did not take her own life, the Ducotes had one final task. Megan's parents wanted full custody of her boys. Dustin had lived with them for nearly 9 years since her passing. The judge approved their request for full custody and terminated Dustin's parental rights. On April 20th, 2023, Missy and Steve Ducote were awarded full custody of the children. It was a long ride for the Ducotes, but they persisted to the very end. They believe their daughter is looking down from heaven with a smile and giving them a thumbs up for a job well done. Megan Parra's cause of death has been officially listed as homicide. Although Megan did not open up about issues in her marriage, her father feared that the couple may have been fighting days before her death. The autopsy result showed she had bruises on her chest and abdomen. She may have discovered something about Dustin and wanted to leave the marriage. This may have led to an uncontrollable fight. Steve Ducote was worried. He spoke to an investigator about the fingerprints on the gun. The expert doubted that Knight had fingerprinted the weapon within 2 days. Usually the process takes 2 weeks to a few months, depending on the circumstances surrounding the case. Why then was Knight in a hurry to close the case? Well, it was too late because the police had returned the gun to Dustin and he had moved on. Steve was convinced that there was something to look at. He begged the police to give him a listening ear, but they shrugged him off. But 4 months later, a local judge agreed to help. Steve convinced him that some details were left out during the investigation. Dan Schaub was a gentle and patient man. He was the Criminal Investigations Unit Commander at the Avoyelles Parish Sheriff's Office. The judge assigned him to the case. Dan dived into the case immediately. Sadly, he had only little facts to work with. Knight made his job harder. After speaking to witnesses, he asked for evidence from Megan's cell phone, but did not get it. And the reason? The second investigation was discreet. Dustin didn't even know about it. The family didn't want to make it obvious to him. Dan was surprised to hear that the investigation was hidden from Dustin, but he pressed on. They agreed to speak to Dustin when they had found more evidence against him. Dan referred to Christopher Knight's report. He examined the 115 pictures related to the case and talked to 2 witnesses. Earlier, 2 neighbors confirmed they heard a gunshot from Megan's house twice. The first neighbor reported hearing the sound a little after 7 a.m., but the second neighbor claimed he heard a gunshot 2 hours later. Dan put the time at 9:15 a.m. One fact was evident. Someone pulled the trigger that ended Megan's life. The troubling question begging the answer was this: was Dustin at home by 9:15 a.m.? If he was, then he knew something about his wife's death. Dan found an answer. Dustin was not home at the time. State police told him that he saw Dustin at an intersection near Walmart before 9 a.m. As Dan questioned this evidence, he found proof of Dustin's whereabouts. It was a time-stamped receipt. The receipt confirmed that Dustin left Walmart at 9:43 a.m. Dan was convinced that Dustin was not at home when the shot was fired. On January 15, 2015, he released an 8-page report stating that Megan died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Megan's family was heartbroken. The report was a setback to their theory that Megan was murdered. Dan relied on the neighbor's claim of hearing a gunshot around 9:15 a.m. He neglected the first account. Surprisingly, Dan Schaub's report was a blessing in disguise. Megan's family press harder. Each of the pictures at the crime scene had valuable clues. David Blanchard was gracious enough not to delete them. He saved them in his camera, believing that something was suspicious about Megan's death. He dutifully submitted the original copies of the pictures to Avoyelles Parish District Attorney Charles Riddle. Riddle handed them over to Steve and Betsy. Megan's father and sister went through all the photos from that day. Yes, it was hard, but they had to. Betsy spent hours surfing the internet to learn about blood spatter patterns. The blood around her sister didn't look right. She got insights from experts who explained how blood spatter from suicide looked. It was nothing like what she saw. She believed that her sister was rolled over after she was shot. Even more troubling was that the gun was wiped clean. And then there was the picture of Megan's boys in her pocket. Did she carry the picture around so early that morning? Why did she have them with her in the first place? Steve theorized that Dustin planted it there to make it look like suicide. As for the suicide note on the kitchen counter, Steve contested that his daughter wrote it. Megan was a kindergarten teacher who did not write in solid print. Her family argued that she struggled to live in her last minutes on Earth. The living room depicted a fight scene. A partly broken guitar was on the floor, and the wine rack hid behind a chair. Having identified crucial details from the pictures, Steve and Betsy hurried back to District Attorney Riddle. They discussed specific information that had been overlooked in the previous investigations. Riddle agreed with Steve. The scene looked like a carefully planned murder. He then contacted the sheriff's office for a third look at the case, but they declined. David Lemoyne was fired up to take on one more case after retirement. He called his friend Zach Shelton, a fellow retired agent. Shelton was in. He knew there was more to the case than meets the eye. The first step to reopening the case was to get a badge. Officer Ernest Anderson, Cottonport's police chief, agreed to deputize Lemoyne and Zach Shelton. 2019 was a good year for Megan's family. Soon after, interrogations began. Chris Knight was invited for a conversation on January 15, 2019. He was at the scene on the day of the shooting. He arrived first before calling for backup. With him was Chad Johnson, a detective and blood spatter expert. Knight claimed that Johnson confirmed to him that Megan shot herself, but Johnson refuted it. He didn't give a yes or no answer when asked if it was a suicide. He told Knight that the scene had been contaminated. He advised him to probe further until he rules out homicide. Unfortunately, that never happened. Chris Knight did not send the gun for testing. He didn't consider other possibilities either. He was young and naive. His conclusion was based on speculation. Next to enter the interview room was Megan Parra. His session lasted a little above an hour. It was the first intense interrogation since 2014. Shelton asked if he and Megan fought days before her death. He admitted they had issues, but it was a typical married couple problem. Dustin recalled that weeks before her death, she was depressed and asked off-putting questions about death. Sadly, she only mentioned it to Dustin. Megan never said a word about her depression to her parents or sisters. If she was depressed, the chances are that she was suicidal too. Why did he leave her alone to go to Walmart if this was the case? Dustin was quiet. Shelton asked him about his affairs. Dustin nodded in affirmation. He confirmed to the agents that he had an affair, but his wife did not know about it. Even if she did, she didn't confront him. Dustin was asked about the suicide note which Shelton and Lemoyne believe he planted. He was unsure about the writer, but he denied any knowledge of it. His response was not convincing enough to let him off the hook. He denied having anything to do with Megan's death and accused the FBI agents of trying to frame him. It was evident that Dustin had something to hide. Maybe Megan shot herself in front of him, but he jetted out to Walmart. Better still, they got into a fight, and she grabbed the gun and mistakenly pulled the trigger. Dustin refuted both scenarios. He insisted he was not home when she was shot. Dustin became increasingly uncomfortable with the interrogation and opted out. The third witness they interviewed was Ann Guillory, the neighbor who heard a gunshot early that morning. Ann's story was consistent. The sound was loud enough to draw attention. The fourth person on their radar was the second neighbor. He heard the gunshot around 9:15 a.m., but wasn't sure what it was. Shelton and Lemoyne were convinced that the first gunshot killed Megan. Upon shooting his wife, Dustin may have driven to Walmart to cover up his crime. The final lap on Megan Parra's case, 2019, was a long and challenging year for the Ducoats. It was the year they unearthed new evidence for their case. 2020 brought renewed hope for justice. David Lemoyne and Zach Shelton were optimistic that the case would be wrapped up soon. Unfortunately, COVID happened, leading to David Lemoyne's unfortunate death. But his brother Peter Lemoyne, following closely behind, took over from there. He was a worthy partner. He worked as hard as his brother as if it was a personal project. In April 2021, Steve hired an independent crime scene analyst, Eric Richardson, to help out. He requested that he check for suspicious blood spatter on Dustin's clothing. With over 320 homicides under his belt, Richardson was the man for the job. He examined the shorts Dustin Parra wore that day, but noticed something weird. He found a fine mist of blood under the pocket flap. This pattern suggests that it was caused by high-velocity blood spatter from a gunshot wound. Richardson reported that Dustin was there when the gun was discharged into Megan's head. He also agreed that the gun had been wiped clean to conceal traces of the alleged shooter. The only explanation for this was that Dustin killed Megan. Charles Riddle gathered the new evidence and took the case to a grand jury.